Her story begins long before the cameras ever found her. Before the gowns, before the diamonds, before the softened glow of Hollywood made her face feel like something between a memory and a promise. Audrey Hepburn entered the world in 1929 in Brussels, born into a household shaped by discipline, aristocratic residue, and the quiet austerity of Europe that still carried the aftertaste of old empires.
It is true that I had an extraordinary mother. She herself was not a very affectionate person in the sense that I today consider affection. I spent a lot of time looking for it, and I found it. She was a fabulous mother. But she came from an era, she was born in 1900, Victorian influence still, of great discipline, of great ethics, a lot of love within her, not always able to show it.
Her mother, Ella von Hemstra, was of Dutch noble lineage, and she carried herself with a kind of severe refinement that does not ask for attention but expects obedience. There was nothing soft in the architecture of that upbringing. It was controlled, formal, and emotionally restrained in a way that belonged to a more fragile, fading Victorian world model than the modern century Audrey was stepping into. Manners were not decorative. They were law. Silence had weight, and composure was survival. From this early environment, Audrey learned something unusual that would later define her presence in the world. She learned how to occupy space without consuming it, how to be present without imposing, how to listen so completely that others felt enlarged in her company. These were not Hollywood skills. They were survival traits formed in a household where approval was conditional and warmth was rationed. Her father, Joseph Hepburn Rustin, was largely absent, and his departure left a kind of emotional absence that followed Audrey throughout childhood like a shadow that never fully decided whether it belonged to grief or curiosity. What remained was her mother's structure, and within it, an expectation of discipline that extended to every gesture, every posture, every sentence spoken at the table. Audrey was not raised to be seen. She was raised to be correct. But history has a way of interrupting even the most carefully arranged lives. When World War II reached the Netherlands, Audrey was a teenager living in Arnhem. The war stripped away the gentility of her upbringing and replaced it with a scarcity so extreme that elegance became almost irrelevant. Food was rationed to near nothing. Heat disappeared from homes. People lived in a state of quiet endurance, moving through days that felt like they had been thinned down to their most essential elements. It is here that the myth of Audrey is often misunderstood. She was not a soldier. She was not a resistance fighter in the cinematic sense. But she lived inside a resistance ecosystem. She witnessed occupation firsthand, and she contributed in quieter, more fragile ways that were nonetheless real. She carried messages. She performed in secret ballet recitals intended to raise funds for the Dutch resistance. She lived through the Hunger Winter, a period so severe that malnutrition permanently affected her health. That experience left a residue in her body and in her psychology. Her later thinness was not simply aesthetic. It was partially historical. A body that had learned scarcity does not forget easily. And yet, even in those years, something in her remained oriented towards grace. Not as a decoration, but as resistance. When the world becomes brutal, gentleness can become a form of defiance. After the war, Audrey trained as a dancer in London. Ballet was her original dream, and for a time it seemed possible. But her body, weakened by wartime deprivation, could not meet the rigorous demands of professional dance at the highest level. That failure, if it can be called that, redirected her life towards acting. It is one of those quiet turns of fate that reshapes culture without announcing itself. She began taking on small film roles, then gradually larger ones, until she reached the moment that would define her emergence. In 1959, she starred in Roman Holiday, playing a runaway princess who briefly escapes royal obligation and experiences a single unguarded day of ordinary life. What made her performance unusual was not volume or intensity. It was restraint. Audrey did not perform as someone trying to dominate the screen. She performed as someone trying to understand it. Her voice, when it appeared, had a light, slightly accented softness, shaped by multilingual upbringing and a continental education.
I had experience in working hard. Ballet is hard, discipline. Those were the things I could contribute. I wasn't a tearing beauty. I didn't have any way for them to know of whether I could really act. But in Willie's sensitivity, in Billy's sensitivity, they realized there was enough there for them as a human being to draw out. And that has been my limitations also. I've never been able to declaim Shakespeare or do those kind of things. What I'm really trying to say is I never really became an actress.
It carried a clarity without force. It felt like speech designed not to persuade, but to invite. That tonal quality became one of her signatures. She spoke as if interruption would be impolite, even when she held the emotional center of the scene. There was a rhythm to her delivery that suggested thoughtfulness happening in real time. Not scripted, certainly, but lived reflection. Hollywood, which often rewards excess, found itself strangely reoriented by her presence. What followed was a series of roles that cemented her place in cinematic history. In Sabrina, she transformed from a chauffeur's daughter into a figure of elegance caught between worlds of wealth and identity. In Breakfast at Tiffany, she became perhaps her most iconic self, playing Holly Golightly, a character draped in contradiction, both detached and yearning, luminous yet unknowable. And yet even in these performances, Audrey never fully disappeared into glamour. There was always a trace of distance, as if she were aware that beauty itself was something fragile and temporary, not to be worshipped, but simply observed. This awareness is part of what distinguishes her legacy from that of many contemporaries. Audrey Hepburn was not simply an actress. She had become a cultural calibration point for what elegance could mean in a modern, increasingly noisy world. But her personal life remained more private than public perception often allows. She married twice, first to actor Mel Ferrer, and later to Andrea Dotti, an Italian psychiatrist. Both marriages contained moments of happiness and difficulty, but neither defined her in a way the public narrative sometimes expects celebrity lives to be defined. She had 2 sons, and in her later years she often spoke less about fame and more about motherhood, travel, and humanitarian work. There is a tendency in popular memory to freeze her at her most photographed moments, but Audrey's later life was deeply shaped by her work with children in crisis regions around the world. She became a goodwill ambassador for UNICEF, traveling to places where hunger and displacement were not historical memories but present realities. She visited Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Somalia, among others. These were not ceremonial appearances. They were emotionally consequential journeys. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak publicly, her tone carried a kind of restrained urgency, as if she had learned that the most effective way to describe suffering is not to dramatize it, but to acknowledge it plainly. In these later years, her voice gained a slightly more grounded weight, but it never lost its gentleness. There is something notable about the way she communicated even difficult truths. She did not moralize. She did not elevate herself above the situation she witnessed. She simply described them.
I was so terribly lucky to really, by chance, fall into a period in movie making when these directors were around and wanted me. And that has been a sort of miracle of my career, because I haven't made that many pictures. But they were all, one after the other, 4 great directors, yes, and with great actors.
And in that simplicity, there was a kind of moral gravity that audience found difficult to ignore. It is worth noting how consistent this pattern was throughout her life. Whether in film, in interviews, or in humanitarian work, Audrey's presence remained unusually unintrusive. She did not command space. She refined it. There are lesser-known details that deepen this portrait. For instance, she often struggled with self-perception, particularly in relation to beauty. Despite becoming one of the most recognizable faces in the world, she did not see herself as conventionally beautiful in a way others did.
And you know, when I look back on that period, at a time when Marilyn Monroe had made curves the fashion, you know, you really sort of did away with bosoms and curves all on your own.
Not really. They're still around. I just wasn't blessed with them, but you know, I made it to this lovely interview, nevertheless, years later, in spite of the fact that I had no curves.
She once suggested, in various reflections, that she considered her appeal to come more from movement, posture, and expression than static features. This self-awareness may have contributed to her discipline's physicality on screen. Nothing about her presence felt accidental. She was also known for her quiet humor that rarely dominated interviews but surfaced in brief, unexpected moments. It was not comedic performance. It was lightness. The kind that appears when someone has learned not to take their own image too seriously. Her relationships with directors and co-stars often reflected a professional humility. She was not known for demanding attention on set. Instead, she was known for preparation, punctuality, and an almost meticulously respect for the collaborative nature of filmmaking. This made her an unusually easy to work with in an industry often defined by ego. Yet beneath that ease was a deeper emotional texture shaped by early deprivation and wartime memory. Those who knew her later in life often remarked on a certain attentiveness to her gaze, as if she was always partially listening for something beyond the immediate conversation. Not distraction, but her depth of awareness. Her influence on fashion and cultural aesthetics was profound, though she never claimed authority over it. The simplicity of her style, often created in collaboration with designers like Hubert von Givenchy, became a visual luggage of its own. Clean lines, minimal ornamentation, silhouettes that emphasize presence rather than decoration. It was elegance that refused excess. But perhaps her most enduring legacy is not aesthetic at all. It is ethical. Audrey Hepburn represented a form of grace that was not dependent on wealth, performance, or dominance. It was a grace built on restraint, empathy, and attentiveness. In a century increasingly defined by speed and amplification, she embodied something slower and more deliberate. A kind of human presence that did not need to overwhelm in order to be remembered. In her final years, illness reduced her physical strength, but not her clarity of intention. She continued her work for UNICEF until her health made travel impossible. Even then, she remained connected to the organization, continuing to advocate for children's welfare in quieter ways.
Did you say that immortal phrase, move your blooming?
Yes, that I did. That wasn't dubbed
You did
in.
all of that.
Yeah. I can do that all over again. No, that I did.
Audrey passed away in 1993, but her image did not fade. It multiplied, diffused through cinema, fashion, humanitarian memory, and cultural myth. Yet what remains most compelling is not the image itself, but the consistency behind it. From a strict, almost Victorian-influenced upbringing, through the devastation of war, through the fragile reconstruction of post-war Europe, into the artificial brilliance of Hollywood, and finally into global humanitarian work. Audrey Hepburn's life traces a continuous line. That line is not one of fame. It is one of refinement under pressure. Audrey learned early how fragile the world can be, and instead of hardening in response, she softened into precision. There is a particular kind of voice that history remembers differently. Not because it was loud, but because it was clear. Audrey Hepburn spoke in that register, not as an attempt to stand above others, but as a way of making the world feel momentarily more ordered, more attentive, more human. And in that sense, her legacy is not merely cinematic or cultural. It is atmospheric. A reminder that grace, when practiced consistently, becomes something closer to architecture than performance. A structure you can feel even after the person who built it is gone.